Riot police in Belarus have fired stun grenades at demonstrators in the capital, Minsk, hours before the expiry of a deadline set by the opposition, calling on the country's long-term leader, Alexander Lukashenko, to resign or face a general strike. More than 100,000 people are estimated to have joined the protests. The Belarusian opposition leader in exile, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, said the authorities had shown they were only capable of violence and that the threatened strike would start on Monday. From Moscow, here's Steve Rosenberg.
This was the moment the centre of Minsk descended into chaos and violence. What you can hear are stun grenades fired by the riot police. What you can see is blind panic. Anti-government protesters run for cover. They come out to deliver an ultimatum. Either Alexander Lukashenko agrees to resign, or from Monday there'll be a nationwide strike. From the authorities, the response, as you can see, was no. Police sparked terror as they hunted down protesters in apartments. Earlier, tens of thousands had taken to the streets to accuse Mr. Lukashenko of stealing the presidency. The strength of feeling against him seems as strong as ever. But will the Belarusian people heed the call for a national strike? Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the opposition leader who's been forced into exile, hopes they will.
I think that the will of Belarusian people can be changed. And even if we are not succeed or if we are not get the effect we are waiting for, people will be looking for another kind of struggle, another kind of protest, but we will not stop.
Last week, Mr. Lukashenko accused protesters of behaving arrogantly and warned they would face the consequences. So the use of force is no surprise. But it was a violent crackdown on peaceful protesters that helped spark the mass protests back in August. It's unlikely to end them now. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Well, to talk about these developments and what they all mean, I'm joined by Alina Kudsko, director of the Globsec Policy Institute. It's a think tank based in Bratislava, Slovakia. Alina, thanks for making time for us. Now, protesters are calling for a general strike to start on Monday. What do you think is going to happen?
That is definitely very difficult to predict. A lot of people are going to strike. A lot of people are going to take off to express solidarity with the strikers. But we should also understand the difficult situation in which the people of Belarus are. Striking has been a very difficult and risky enterprise in the country. The government has taken every possible measure to intimidate people and prevent strikes from happening. A lot of leaders of the striking committees were arrested, and some of them had to flee the country. People who intended to strike were fired. Workers are facing a very difficult choice, as jobs are very scarce, especially outside Minsk, and the government controls most of the jobs. Even private companies are facing persecution for being closed down on the strike days. Hence, it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, but this is by no means implies that the protests are going to decrease in number or scale.
Indeed, you mentioned, though, that so many opposition leaders have been arrested or have been forced to flee the country. So what state is the opposition in?
We have a very interesting situation in the country. We have the opposition that is very resilient and has not lost its resolve, and we have the government that is not budging in. So we definitely have a stalemate, and each side is trying to break it. The opposition, for its part, is trying to come up with more and more creative strategies that are keeping the government off guard and forcing the government to make more and more mistakes. This deadline that is set for today is one of these strategies to put more pressure on the government.
Is there any indication the government's bending at all?
Not so far. The government has responded with more and more violence, but on the other hand, it also had to adapt its tactics. Over the past weeks, the government has been very brutal with the protesters, including the use of violence. It also has fired a lot of people. A lot of journalists were stripped of their accreditation. But interestingly, recently, Lukashenko has met several political prisoners for what he claims was an attempt to negotiate with the opposition. He seems to be succeeding in co-opting a couple of them in trying to pose as the legitimate representatives of the opposition while sidelining the rest of the movements. But the rest of the country does not seem to be buying it in.
Alina, thanks for that update. That was Alina Kutsko speaking to us from Slovakia.
Thank you for having me.